Alright, everyone. Welcome back. Haven't done a video since, about a couple weeks ago. Alright, anyway. Today we're doing the Oversimplified video I said we would do. This one is on Adolf Hitler, as it's April 30th, and why not? Why the fuck not? I could have done a video on April 20th, but I didn't want to do them so close together. So here we are on April 30th. And remember, May 2nd is the second video to the Battle of Berlin. So if you are actually fucking interested, we can go with that. But we're going to begin here with part 1, and we're going to go into part 2 as well. Well, if my device doesn't die on the way there. So let's get going.
Look at this baby. So gentle, so innocent. You'd think this child would grow up to become a good man, an honest man. Well, think again.
Now you're going to see the Nazi swastikas in this video, because I'm not going to censor them out, because why the fuck would I do that?
Hitler was born Adolphus Hitler in 1889 in a...
Yeah, he was born Adolphus Hitler. He also did not have a middle name. Adolf Hitler was did not have a middle name, as far as I could tell. And if you know if he did or not, feel free to comment it. But I've never heard of him having a middle name. Kind of interesting too with Adolf Eichmann, who was also Austrian, and I think he went to the same school Adolf Hitler went to. And Adolf Eichmann, his real name is not Adolf Eichmann; it's Otto Adolf Eichmann. So kind of a weird thing there with the Austrians.
Small town in Austria-Hungary. His father, Alois Schicklgruber, was born out of wedlock, but eventually changed his name to that of his stepfather, becoming Alois Hitler.
There is some speculation that Hitler wasn't the original name that he was chosen. It was the guys who were recording it fucked it up. I think it was supposed to be L.E. Hitler or something like that, but they fucked it up and it became Hitler.
Alois was a mid-level Austrian customs officer, not really rolling in cash, but certainly rolling in women.
Pretty much.
He married a rich, older lady, but then immediately started having affairs, including one with a much younger house servant. A few years later, he left his sick wife to be with his mistress, but since the Catholic Church didn't allow divorce at the time, he couldn't marry her. So he waited for his old wife to die and had a child in the meantime. Then his wife died, so he married his mistress and had another child, but then his new wife got sick, so he employed his much younger cousin Clara to take care of her. Then when his new wife died, he immediately got Clara, his cousin, pregnant, and then married her.
I know what you were thinking. You're like, what the fuck is wrong with them? But at this time, this was very common and happened literally everywhere.
In that order, you rock star. Clara and Alois had 3 children together, who all tragically died while in infancy. So when the 4th child, Adolf, came along, Clara spoiled him rotten. The Hitlers had 2 more kids, and the family moved around a few times, meaning Adolf had to attend 5 different elementary schools. Adolf's father was strict, quick to anger, and took most of it out on the eldest son, until he had enough and ran away at the age of 14, leaving 7-year-old Adolf to do most of the chores and get berated by his father. The result was a difficult relationship.
Like, when you read, the situation between Adolf and his father was quite abusive, and it created a very strong hatred between the two. Especially when Alois asked Adolf to go to the civil service.
With his dad, while he was super attached to his mother, who worried over him and his health excessively. Hitler did well in school at first. His grades were good and his teachers praised him. He was popular with the other kids and enjoyed gathering them together to play war games. He also loved reading and particularly liked stories about cowboys and Indians. As he grew older, though, he started to get into trouble. He was caught smoking once, organized a raid on a local orchard, tormented his pro-Austria religion teacher with symbolic gestures, displaying his allegiance to the idea of united Germanic people under a greater German state in defiance of
Adolf Hitler's father, like I said before, was a civil servant, and because of that, he tended to not do anything his father liked, which included being part of Germany. So obviously he was very pro-German, which also kind of doesn't make sense, as which doesn't make sense because the part of Austria he lives in is Germanic anyway. Even in Mein Kampf too, even asked why Austria wasn't part of the German Reich, which was the German Empire at the time.
Austria, you know, the usual. All of this
Also, I just had to say, for that time, it's not the correct flag.
enraged Adolf's father, who punished him severely. The area of Austria-Hungary that Hitler lived in was once part of the German Confederation, and many of the people who lived there considered themselves to be German. Adolf tended to just go against whatever his father said, and since his father was an Austrian public official, Hitler got big into German nationalism. This enraged Adolf's father, who punished him severely. Around this time, a family tragedy struck. His 6-year-old brother, whom he loved a lot, died of measles when Adolf was 10, and was buried in the cemetery just across from their home. Around this time, neighbors reported a change in the young boy. Strange behaviors such as talking to trees and staying up late staring at the stars from the cemetery walls. He lost interest in religion, and his school grades started to decline, which enraged his father, who punished him severely. It also didn't help that he had just entered high school, and the cool city boys treated him like a rural peasant. He had to repeat a grade and had little interest in most school subjects.
Well, I mean, like, he was a rural peasant. Also, if you hear literally any noise in the background, the area of which I live is being hit by a fucking storm at the moment.
Instead, spending his time reading and drawing, which he was quite good at. One day his father said, "Son, someday you'll be a big balls public official like me." And Adolf replied, "No, father, I'm going to become an artist and soar high above the clouds with the eagles." This enraged his father, but by this time he was an old-ass man, so he just sort of let it go, and then died of a lung hemorrhage. Hitler just about passed his final semester and celebrated in the typical way by getting blackout drunk and wiping his ass with the certificate.
Which is a true story. It did happen. I don't know why. But he didn't actually pass high school.
However, he didn't take the overall final school exam, instead just dropping out. The now 16-year-old boy was unemployed, without much purpose in life, and for the next 3 years, he stayed that way. He spent most of his time at the opera with his only friend, August Kubizek. Kubizek later wrote his memories of the young Hitler, and said he was passionately interested in many things, felt he was in many ways better than others his age, was quick to anger just like his father, and an incredible speaker once he was ranting. When he was 8...
The thing about the opera house, too, is Kubizek became very good friends with Adolf Hitler, and they became friends, interestingly, over competing for a spot in the standing portion of the opera house, and they just became best friends after that. In Unpopular Opinion Time, if you read The Young Hitler I Knew by August Kubizek, yeah, if you read that book, Adolf he's a tsundere. I'm not lying. He pretty much is.
He said a very sad goodbye to his mother and went to Vienna to take the entrance exam for art school.
Well, he is for at least the early years of he is for at least the first couple of years in Vienna.
Soon after, he had to return home. His mother was sick and her health was rapidly deteriorating. Hitler stayed by her.
I believe between his art schools, between that time, he was he and August Kubizek were living in the same dormitory, I say. Well, they were roommates, and when his mother was dying, I believe he left unexpectedly and just kind of never came back.
And when she eventually died, the family doctor said he had never seen someone so overwhelmed with grief as Hitler was. Then Hitler returned to Vienna, still hoping to find a career in the arts, but he never did. Instead, without parental support, Hitler ended up on the streets. Now in his early 20s, he spent a few rough years living in and out of homeless shelters, making what little he could from...
Actually, we're going to continue for a second.
Selling postcards he painted. It's hard to...
Okay. He skipped over a lot of stuff here. You never mentioned he lived with August Kubizek in the early parts of his Vienna years. Second of all, the homeless shelter in which he lived was, well, it wasn't very good, and they were kind of mistreated. And so he actually made a business partner there, and they would go out on a business, and they would actually make quite a bit of money. The guy he was working with, I don't remember his name, but I know I read about him somewhere. He and Adolf would paint the postcards. He would go out and sell them to art dealers and museums and all that. He would go out and do it. Eventually that business fell apart, though, because how normal businesses fall apart. Feuds over money. Another thing you didn't mention, interestingly, in 1913, some of the big names, Trotsky, Stalin, Adolf here, Freud, Sigmund Freud, you heard of him, famous neurosurgeon, and Field Marshal Tito and Vladimir Lenin were all living in Vienna in 1913. And interestingly, in the summer of that year, they all went to the same coffee house. Whether they met each other or they talked at the same time, we don't know. We just know they went there. Again, have any more information on that? Love to see it.
Pinpoint exactly when and how Hitler's extreme ideological beliefs formed, but his time in Vienna would have certainly played a role. Anti-Semitism was widespread in the city. The mayor, whom Hitler supported, was an outspoken anti-Semite. There were many right-wing anti-Semitic newsletters, which Hitler took a keen interest in. He bought into the conspiracy theories and became a firm believer in the idea that there are many races in constant struggle with one another, the purest of which were the German Aryan people, and the worst of which, he believed, were Jews. Since Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire full of...
Well, I mean, like, what people forget is that Adolf Hitler was nothing less than a byproduct of his situation. He was a complete byproduct of it. And so, the city, the part of Vienna he lived in, was very anti-Semitic and very nationalistic. So he ended up supporting them, and that's kind of where most of the Nazi ideology formed.
Lesser races, Hitler wasn't a fan. So when he was 24, he moved to Munich in Germany to avoid doing military service.
Well, yeah, but before that, he was living on the streets.
And for one more year, he was a drifter on the streets until something huge happened. In 1914, long-standing tensions in Europe...
The Great War!
...into the First World War. Crowds across Europe celebrated the news. Within days, Hitler volunteered for the German army.
Okay, so you didn't see it there, and I'm not going to pull it up, but there is a picture of Adolf Hitler celebrating the outbreak of the Great War. There's a picture of it, I believe. And it's kind of interesting.
The war gave him a purpose in life. His fellow soldiers gave him friendship and brotherhood. Despite the horrors of war, Hitler considered it to be the best time of his life. He was reportedly a brave soldier and was awarded the Iron Cross, first class.
It's also skipped over he was awarded the Iron Cross, second class. But yeah, he did consider it the best part of his life. He also was at some of the major battles. I believe he was at the Somme. He was at the Christmas truce as well. He's part of that. Though he was not a fan of the Christmas truce. And I believe he was at Passchendaele, and there's a couple others he was at. By the end of the war, he was a Lance Corporal. So...
and had many close encounters with death. His luck ran out in 1916, however, when an artillery shell injured his leg. He went back to Germany to recover and was outraged to find a general apathetic anti-war attitude among the exhausted and hungry German populace.
Literally, yeah. Germany was not keen on the war anymore because the British blockade was blocking literally everything. So they went with unrestricted U-boat warfare, which led to Wilson, who, by the way, is one of the worst presidents the United States has ever had, to be like, that's not okay. And so he tried to get involved. But the retards who say unrestricted submarine warfare is bad doesn't make sense, because what is it supposed to do? Let your enemy have the supplies?
With the war turning against Germany, he returned to the front lines, but was temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in 1918. A month later, still recovering in hospital.
Well, he was blinded by the attack because his mustache, which was not the mustache we all know him for today, his mustache at the time was actually too big for to fit into his gas mask. So he was affected by the gas, and then he cut his mustache a little bit.
Hitler learned of Germany's defeat and surrender. The terms of the peace treaty were tough on Germany. It had to pay a lot of money and lose a lot of soldiers. These conditions weakened Germany and humiliated the German people. Europe's borders changed after the war too. New countries were formed out of Russia's lost territory. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and there was one big new country splitting Germany into two. Hitler, seeing the country he loved humiliated like this...
The entire point of the Treaty of Versailles was to punish Germany and nothing less. As, well, they were like, well, you started the war, which they didn't. Do remember, the Great War was not started by the Germans. Well, it was, but it was started by the Austro-Hungarians and not the German Empire.
Said that hatred grew in him for those responsible, by which he meant communists and Jews, who he believed had stabbed Germany in the back by spreading dissent and anti-war propaganda back home.
Alright, that's the first video. And, well, yeah, that's pretty much how he saw it. It was basically all that and nothing less. So we're going to go on to part 2. Hopefully it doesn't give me an ad. Fuck you. Alright, I might not cut this out. I just leave it there.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant.
Yep.
After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about...
They didn't attempt a revolution, they had a revolution. In 1918 to 1919, Bulgaria had a communist revolution where they literally became a Soviet republic, even though they were never formally recognized by Leon Trotsky or Vladimir Lenin, who at the time were leading the USSR, or Soviet Russia. They were never recognized, and the only person holding them together was the leader of that. Was the leader of it, and was the leader of the revolution. And so when he died, it kind of fell apart. Later, just kind of dissolving and being retaken over by the Freikorps.
Communism in general. So Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags. So Hitler
Socialism.
went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs. So he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leader.
Yeah, I do remember the NSDAP was not originally named the NSDAP. And two, it wasn't originally led by Adolf Hitler either. It was led by some other guy, I don't remember. I also believe during his time in prison, we'll get to that later, but prison, yeah, it was led by somebody else during that time too.
And supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme.
Well, Nazi came from the way the Germans pronounce National Socialist, or National. So that's where Nazi comes from, if you're actually wondering.
The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive Whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment.
The SA. And so, I don't know about the first two, but yeah. He formed the Sturm Battalion. And these were the original Schutzstaffel, SS, if you would say so. Of which, interestingly, the SS were a subunit of the SA.
Or SA for short. Their job was to defend Nazi party meetings and intimidate political opponents, and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time.
I mean, like, when you really think about it, you cannot blame the Germans for supporting the Nazis, as the economic crisis brought on by the Great War was bad. The economic crisis brought on by the Great Depression was worse. And they were literally mistreated. The Allies basically just took them out to a ditch, basically walked them outside, took them to a ditch, and shot them in the back of the head. That's basically what it was.
The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective.
It wasn't weak and ineffective. It just didn't fucking work. Nothing about the Weimar Republic was good. You can't say anything great about it.
In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, $1 was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, $1 was equal to 4.2 trillion marks.
That's what I was talking about before. This economic crisis that got brought on was Yeah, it was bad. And the Great Depression made it worse.
Price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany...
It was bad. It was bad. You think it's bad like, at all in the modern era? Like, when COVID hit or the 2008 recession or any of that? You have no idea what this is. This was bad. This is worse than the Great Depression in America. This was really, really bad.
Struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were fearful.
Yeah, France had no like legal right to do that, but no one was going to stop them because everybody just kind of hated Germany.
And Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November
Beer hall
1923,
push.
inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched...
Okay, what he didn't mention there was there was actually several high-ranking generals, I believe, in that beer hall, of which I think one took part in it.
on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not.
Well, they weren't really police, more Freikorps, more paramilitary, so...
Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. And when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he...
Yeah, several nations actually have this, but prisons are basically a hotel resort. You don't really not want to get arrested. Like, if you get arrested, it's not like America, like, where you're hoping you'll fucking live. You get arrested here, you're basically like, okay, take me there.
Plenty of time to write a book. The whole affair was...
I actually own a copy of Mein Kampf. Yeah, I own a copy of Mein Kampf. Part of the reason I own it is historical documentation.
Covered by the media nationwide, and it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany.
Yeah. The birthplace of Nazism is Munich and Nuremberg. Now, if you remember anything about Cold D. Blackest Cold War here, you say that they said Berlin was the heart of the Nazi Reich. No, it fucking wasn't. It was Nuremberg and Munich. I don't know why they said that, but that's not even close to true.
But the everyday Germans still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2%.
Something big's gonna happen.
Many were still intimidated.
I know he's gonna get to it, but something big's about to happen.
A politician like he was, but a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were
This is why you can't blame the Germans for supporting the Nazis.
German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for...
like, he didn't hate just the Jews. He hated a lot of other people just as much, notably communists, which we're also going to get to later.
After years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular, until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president, and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general, Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party, though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism. And leader of the Center Party, von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power. I mean, we'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet. What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. Hitler became chancellor.
Adolf Hitler was a very manipulative man, and he knew how to play the system. So, obviously, everything went wrong.
Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians
still don't know who it is,
and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents. Communists and others were sent off to the first concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect...
Well, you kind of skipped over. The decree that allowed him to imprison the communists was, well, originally it was supposed, okay, you have this power, imprison the communists, stop the revolution. But it turned into, no, I'm not giving up my power. So, he obviously died and he took power.
Opportunity. He introduced a law to Parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator. He still had one problem. The leader of the SA wanted the SA to take over the job of the regular German army, and the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA.
The SA were literally thugs. Like, think of gangs in America. That's basically what they were.
One night in June 1934, he had Ron,
Night of the Long Knives,
SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in the past, reporters who had printed negative articles about him.
You looked
One
like
guy
him,
who
Lloyd.
did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some cases, even their families were murdered. In total, up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army, now satisfied that they wouldn't be replaced, pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute. Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted. And eventually, Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it. This way, it seemed like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose Hitler or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp. German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon, his aggressive foreign policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as
the Great Patriotic War. Right, anyway, yeah, Adolf Hitler was a byproduct of his time. And so, well, yeah, there was that. So, yeah, that's basically it. The entire story of Adolf Hitler right there. You may take a look at World War II, the Great Patriotic War, Part 1, September 1st, this year, and Part 2, September 2nd, this year as well. So, look for those in the next half a year. Oh, I guess that's all you had for me. All right, let's go.